Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I thought about titling this Making God Great Again, but I didn't want it to turn political. So we'll stick with the original title and actually mean it. Something unexpected is happening in 2025. Belief in God and the supernatural appear to be making a comeback. Now, if this were true, why would it be unexpected? Well, let me take you back to 1966 to an iconic cover of Time magazine where they asked the question, is God dead? There was a movement coming out of World War II, coming to grips with the atrocity of the Holocaust, where many theologians and some philosophers claimed that God was dead and out of a job. Fast forward to the early part of the 2000s, you've got this movement called the New Atheist Movement. Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, proclaiming pretty loudly that God is dead and we're better off because of it. In fact, Christopher Hitchens wrote, the late Christopher Hitchens, religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. He wrote in his book, God is Not Great. You add to that the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, going back to the 90s, and how less and less of Americans, especially younger Americans, identify as religious. It would make sense for somebody to think that God's out of a job. But I'm not quite convinced this is the whole story. I think there's some indications that something different is happening, and that God, or at least belief in the supernatural, is making a comeback. Now, for one, the God conversation has shifted. What do I mean it's shifted? I'm talking about over the past 25 years, even the past decade, we now have certain individuals leading the way in spiritual conversations with a very different tenor and approach to spiritual things than leaders in the past. So, for example, Jordan Peterson, author of We Who Wrestle with God. Now, I'm guessing many of you follow Jordan Peterson, aware of who he is, probably one of the leading influencers of our day. I'm still not exactly sure where he stands spiritually. And he said he believes he's a Christian. I don't know that I fully understand. But he looks at Christianity as, in a sense, the great story that's founded some of the rights we have in our country. And quite literally, the impetus for modern science. He calls it the story in which Western civilization is predicated. So rather than the new atheist saying, we got to get rid of Christianity, we'll have a utopia, he's like, actually, there's something good here. Now, this isn't just true for Jordan Peterson. Other thinkers like Joe Rogan and Barry Weiss and Jonathan Rauch, by the way, a gay atheist about 2 months ago, said, America quite literally needs Jesus. Something is happening with leading thinkers today. Second, we've seen some high-profile conversions of people that would not have been expected even a few years ago. So Ayan Hirsi Ali, if you followed her story, she grew up in a very fundamentalist, oppressive Islamic background. For understandable reasons, became an atheist and was one of the vocal new atheists maybe a decade ago or so. Well, November 2023, so about maybe a year and a half ago, she wrote a column. And in this, she describes her story of coming to faith. It was called Why I Am Now a Christian. And let's just say it blew up online and beyond. And she said, I think there's a better way to manage the challenge of existence than either Islam or unbelief had to offer. So high-profile conversions. Third, there's a growing awareness of the failure of secularism. Growing awareness of failure seculars. What do I mean by this? So just in the past few months, a couple books have come out that are somewhat telling. One is by Ross Douthat, who is one of the only conservative columnists at the New York Times. He's Catholic, and he wrote a book called Believe. And he tells a story about how interest in the supernatural in his audience has shifted since he's been there about 15 years or so. There's an openness and an interest in spiritual things. There wasn't when he started. Released a book called Believe, and he said mystery and magic and enchantment seem to be rushing back into the world. Then a Greek Orthodox writer by the name of Rod Dreher wrote a book at the end of 2024 called Living in Wonder. And he makes the case that fascination with UFOs today and renewed interest in psychedelics, and there is a movement towards psychedelics, by the way. Mark my words, you heard it here, how marijuana went from legal to accepted in culture. Psychedelics are on the same trajectory. He says this is symbolic of a deeper spiritual yearning taking place in our culture. Fourth, Bible sales were up 22% at the end of 2024. Now, I don't want to read too much into a stat that's narrow, but there's enough for me to pause and say, wait a minute. The claims that God is dead, God is out of a job, that we can create this secular society that will be better without religion, seem to have turned out to be quite false. And God is rushing back in, or you might say Aslan might be on the move. Now, I want to give you what I would consider 7 pieces of evidence that God is back in 2025. Now, none of this should surprise us. Why? Because Psalms 19:1 and 2, what does David say? He says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. We live in God's world, and the evidence that God is real is from our DNA to creation to our consciences. We should not be surprised by any of this. So let's take a look at the first evidence, you might say, the discovery of the beginning of the universe. Now, what do I mean by this? There's an old joke of some scientists who come to God, and they say, God, we can do everything that you can do. God is like, really? Like what? And they said, well, we can make human beings. He's like, okay, show me. So they reach down and they pick up some dust, and God says, wait a minute, get your own dust. Thank you. One person appreciates that. I was waiting for that. Now, where does dust come from? Stars? Where do stars come from? Quantum fluctuations? Where does that come from? The fact that something exists cries out for a larger explanation. If you go back to the 20th century, some of you might recognize the name Antony Flew. For probably half a century, the second part of the 20th century, he was one of the leading figures in the atheist movement. He helped set the agenda of atheism, so to speak. Well, he actually first presented some of his evidence against God in a paper he called Theology and Falsification in the 1950s at the Socratic Club at Oxford, which interestingly enough was chaired by C.S. Lewis. Yeah, some of you saw that coming. By the way, if you don't know the answer to a question, just say Jesus or C.S. Lewis, and you'll get it right half the time. Well, he presented this before C.S. Lewis, arguing that knowledge of God is meaningless, so to speak. Well, he died in 2010. In 2007, he wrote a book that, let's just say, also stunned the world. It was called There Is a God: How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Now, here's what he wrote. This is a little longer quote than I would typically put, but this captures how powerful a discovery it was in the 20th century. Quite literally, while he's setting the agenda for atheism, he's surprised by the discovery of the beginning of the universe. Here's what he writes. He says, when I first met the Big Bang Theory as an atheist, it seemed to me the theory made a big difference because it suggested that the universe had a beginning and that the first sentence in Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, was related to an event in the universe. As long as the universe could comfortably be thought to be not only without end, but also without beginning, it remained easy to see its existence as just a brute fact. The universe just is. If there had been no reason to think the universe had a beginning, there'd be no reason to postulate something else that produced the whole thing. But if the Big Bang Theory changed all that, if the universe had a beginning, it became entirely sensible, almost inevitable, to ask what produced this beginning. And this is what has been formulated, what's called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. It's really simple. It's a simple argument. I was sitting on a plane and met a student from Chapman a number of years ago, and she's like, you're a professor, you believe in God. Why do you believe in God? I pulled out a napkin. I said, well, let me give you one argument. You can tell me what you think about it. And we had a great conversation. It's two premises and a conclusion. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now stop and think about that. Is that common sense? Do things pop into existence from nothing? When things begin to exist, we assume that there's a sufficient cause for things beginning to exist. We never see things come into existence or observe them without a cause. Minimally, this seems far more reasonable than the opposite, namely that things could begin to exist without a cause. Seems pretty straightforward. But second, the universe began to exist. Now, the Bible has always taught this, namely Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. But what Fluke says is in the 20th century, science seems to catch up and confirm this claim. By the way, when you look in the other cosmogonies, kind of creation accounts of the ancient Near East, they all state the universe is eternal. The book of Genesis is unique in positing the universe actually had a beginning. That's unique to Genesis. Now, I won't go into detail, but the scientific evidence from Big Bang cosmology, from the red shift, point towards the universe having a beginning, lining up with what Genesis teaches. So if whatever begins to exist has a cause and the universe began to exist, then the conclusion is therefore what? The universe. This is the participatory part of the program. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Exactly. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, one option is to deny the first premise and say that things can begin to exist without a cause, and quantum fluctuations do not prove this. The others to deny the universe had a beginning, but there's scientific and philosophically strong evidence this is the case. Therefore, the universe has a cause, which must be outside of the universe, very powerful, personal, timeless, changeless. This sounds a lot like God. You might say the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner. The second evidence that began to emerge is the fine-tuning of the universe. So not only does the universe exist, but it's exquisitely fine-tuned for life. So I'd imagine you come visit me in Southern California. I live in a town called San Juan Capistrano, and there's some undeveloped land behind where I live, and we go walking in the hills and come across this cabin. You're like, let's explore the cabin. So you go walking up, but you hear something strange. You hear the sound of your favorite song in the background, Beat It by Michael Jackson. You ignore the obvious warning and decide to walk in anyways, but you notice something strange. You smell the scent of your most beloved meal. You walk in and there's shoes that are lined up that fit you perfectly, a jacket just your size, the book you like to read on the table. There's a small fridge you open up, the exact snacks you like to munch on. There's a small bathroom. It has the precise toiletries that you use. Now, besides suspecting that you were in a horror movie, What would be the most reasonable explanation for this? At some point, you'd have to say, this can't be coincidence. Someone arranged this cabin with me in mind and is expecting my arrival. That's the most reasonable explanation. Well, interestingly enough, scientists have discovered in many ways the universe is like that cabin. So Freeman Dyson, an acclaimed physicist, he said, as we look out into the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must in some sense have known that we were coming. In other words, this is what the fine-tune refers to. Think if you take a shower in the morning, you have the hot and the cold, what do? You take it and you kind of fine-tune it so it's just right. Or if you've seen an old radio, it's like the radio dial. To get the signal, you fine-tune it so it's just right. There are certain constants in physics and cosmology that for the universe to even be the kind of universe that can sustain complex life, all have to be set within a very narrow, precise range. And the slightest change, and the universe becomes inhospitable to life. So it's like Goldilocks, right? Too hot, too cold, just right. The laws of physics and cosmology are just right. In fact, Frederick Hoyle, who coined the term, an agnostic astronomer, who coined the term the Big Bang, he said it almost seems as if someone's been monkeying with physics. And he's right about that. Now, we could walk through the odds of one of these. There's a few dozen of them, by the way, that each must be set within a narrow range for there to be life. Well, what happens mathematically if we start to add up, say, gravity has to be fine-tuned 1 times 10 with 40 zeros after it, the cosmological constant 1 times 10 with 53 zeros after it? What happens, what becomes the mathematical odds when we add these together? Well, let's just take 2. The odds of 2 of these dozens of factors being fine-tuned where they need to be to allow life is effectively 1 part in 100 million trillion, 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 trillion. Now, that's a big number. If you can't grasp that number, just think of our new national debt. Before Doge got to work, just plain. We'll see. That number is actually so precise, it's beyond the reach of chance. In fact, according to Lee Smolin, an agnostic astronomer, if we took all the numbers that were necessary, you almost couldn't even write down that number in whole because it would take more numbers than the number of elementary particles in the universe. It's so beyond chance. So just like the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner, the fine-tuning points towards a cosmic fine-tuner. This is a discovery over the past few decades that surprised scientists given their thought that God was gone. That is one piece of why people are rethinking this. Third, the origin of life. The origin of life. Now, what do we mean in this sense? Antony Flew, again, formerly agnostic, he became somewhat deistic. He said, how can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replication capabilities, and coded chemistry? That's an interesting question, isn't it? How do you get life from non-life? How do you get living cells and living beings from non-living cells and non-living beings from matter? If you go back to the time of Darwin, all scientists, not just those who weren't Christians, thought that the solution to the origin of life would be simple. Because with the technology we had as we peered down into the cell, it seemed very simple to us. So we thought, well, if you just mix the right chemicals together, life will emerge naturalistically. That was the assumption that many people had. But as science advanced and we could peer into the depths of the cell, we began to see more complexity and sophistication beyond anything humans or artificial intelligence can generate or create today. So, for example, the average human body has 30 trillion cells. Average human body, 30 trillion cells, each of which contains DNA strands that when uncoiled, by the way, each DNA strand would be about 2 meters, about 6 feet in length. So if you have 30 trillion cells, each one 6 feet in length, the question is, how far does the DNA go in your body? Well, if they're all strung together, the DNA in your body would go from here to the sun and back about 200 times. That's incredible, isn't it? That's like stunning to just stop and think about. Well, what does DNA do? It stores information. It stores and processes, and RNA transfers the information. Well, one estimate would be that a single cell in your body has the equivalent of 8 billion letters, 500 million words, or 8,000 books. This is in part why Bill Gates said, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. And that is still true today. Raises an interesting question, doesn't it? If on that small level, there's so much information, then what is an adequate cause that can account for the rise of that information? Well, Stephen Meyer, a Cambridge-trained philosopher of science, writes this. He's at the Discovery Institute. He says, whenever we find specified information and we know the causal story of how that information arose, we always find that it arose from an intelligent source. What does he mean? If you get a text and it's legible, you trace it back to a texter. If you get a blog and read it, you trace it back to a blogger, a book to an author. If it says something on your shirt, you trace it back. Somebody wrote those words. A mind is responsible for those words on your shirt. If I walk out in the clouds that says drink Coke and I'm like, what's that? And you're like, yep, I know you're from California. You don't understand? But that means a storm is coming north here in Louisville when it says drink Coke. By the way, did you notice how I said it? Did you notice how? No, not Coke. That was a good question. Louisville. Was that decent? I came a lot here and actually practiced that, and you don't seem very impressed. For a California boy, I'm moderately impressed that I actually meet people now that are like, I went to Louisville. I'm like, no, that's actually not correct. Let me humbly tell you how it is. Now, there's a lot of things I don't understand about being here, quite a few things that are different from Southern California. But if I see the words drink Coke or drink soda, that doesn't mean a storm is coming. What do we trace that back to? A mind or an intelligence. When we have information and every time we can trace to the source, we always find a mind. We see more information, more sophisticated in the cell. What's the most reasonable conclusion? As Frank Turk would say, I don't have enough faith to believe that this could happen through materialistic, accidental, naturalistic processes. The information in the cell points to an information giver. Fourth sign that God is back is the origin and nature of consciousness. The origin and nature of consciousness. About 3 years ago, I invited on a young libertarian atheist thinker onto my podcast to have a conversation. His name is Coleman Hughes. Maybe some of you recognize him. He's an author. He's brilliant. He went to Columbia University, which is filling up the news right now with debates and discussions everywhere and protests. And I invited him on my show, and I just said, hey, can we talk about race? Because he's written a book on that. But I'd also like to ask you some spiritual questions. He said, sure. Wonderfully thoughtful, charitable guy. And I asked him this question at the end, which is a question I would encourage you to keep in your arsenal, so to speak, for when you're having spiritual conversations with people. I said, is there anything about the universe that gives you pause and makes you think there might be a God? Isn't that a great question? I've actually asked 100 atheists this question. I'm going to do a short video on it. But the question is there anything about the universe that gives you pause and makes you think there might be a God? And one of the things he said is consciousness. He said, how does physical matter arrange itself and just spawn into consciousness, let alone self-consciousness? That's always puzzled me and somewhat bothered me. Well, the narrative is, according to J.P. Moreland, one of the leading Christian philosophers of our day, he said, if you go back to the 18th, 19th century, the idea that we have a soul was dead and considered nonsense. He said in his book, he said, fast forward to the late 20th and early 21st century, things are changing. We're witnessing a resurgence of substance dualism, which is the idea that we are body and soul. We have a material and an immaterial part about us. It's undergoing an unforeseen revival. That's interesting, isn't it? So I wish we had time to do a whole lecture on this one, but I challenge some of my skeptical friends. I say, okay, I know you believe in spiritual things. Explain to me what pain is using physical terminology alone, and you can't. You can only explain it by sensation or hurtfulness, which are not purely physical terms. There's no explanation for the origin of life, and there's no naturalistic explanation for the origin of consciousness. Scientists and philosophers don't have a clue how you can get it. I debated one of the leading skeptics of our day about 6 months ago, Michael Shermer. I asked him to come on for an hour conversation. We ended up debating for 2 hours, God and morality and consciousness. And I said, so you believe we have free will? How do you get free will if it's matter and motion and laws of physics? Explain consciousness. And he said, well, at a certain level of complexity, consciousness just appears. That sounds to me like the ultimate non-explanation. He said, take in an economic system. Sometimes things like inflation just emerge. I said, okay, inflation is an effect. It's not a cause. How do you get something fundamentally different like consciousness from matter and motion? That's not remotely an explanation. And yet, guess what? If we are conscious beings and God is a conscious mind, doesn't it make perfect sense that we would be conscious? We'd expect this. Human consciousness points to a cosmic consciousness. Fifth reason God is back is the moral law. The moral law. In 2010, 15 years ago, this was the year I started my PhD program here. I was invited to debate this high school teacher in my town when I was teaching high school full-time, who was also a PhD. And I was doing research on him ahead of time, and the question was, is God the best explanation for morality or something else? And I heard him on this interview about 2 weeks before we debated. It was posted online. He goes, I'm debating this guy named Sean McDowell. I'm thinking he can't even get my name right. About whether or not you have to believe in God to be moral. At that moment, I thought, he doesn't even understand what we're debating. Of course you don't have to believe in God to be moral. Of course you don't have to believe in God to know right and wrong. Why? Because people who don't believe in God still live in God's world and are made in the image of God that they reject. We know it because Romans 2 says it's written on our hearts. The question is not knowing right and wrong or being moral. The question is, can there be objective moral values and duties if there is no God? That's the question. That was the debate, taken way back with the faux hawk and no gray hair, taking me back 15 years. Now, the moral argument basically says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. In a universe without God, we don't have objective moral values and duties. I think Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great novelist, was right. If there is no God, all is permissible. If there is no God, all is permissible. Now think about it this way. Can you read a book if you don't believe in authors? Sure. But can you have a book without an author? No. Books, to be explained, require authors. That's the moral argument. You can know right and wrong, you can be moral. But if there is no God, we don't have objective moral values and duties. But second, objective moral values and duties do exist. And you know what? We all know this. C.S. Lewis again said, if somebody denies that there's right and wrong, it's only a matter of time before they contradict themselves and condemn you for doing something that they think is immoral. I used to tell my high school students, I'd say, look, if someone tells you there's no such thing as right and wrong, cut in front of them in line. What are they going to say? Hey, that's not right. I got here first, as if there's some objective moral standard we're each bound and have the duty to follow. If there is no God, I don't know where that objective moral value and duty come from. And yet the reality is we all know there's right and wrong. Look, I'm making a point. This is not a political point, but what's interesting right now is one of the big issues in our world is the war that's going on in Palestine, in Israel. And one side says Israel is committing genocide. The other side says Hamas is committing genocide. There's not a third side that says, what's the big deal about genocide? It's like choosing ice cream flavor. Why is everybody getting upset? There's no right and wrong. There is no side. I'm sure there's some guy who has a YouTube channel somewhere making that case. But none of them take that person seriously. Why? We all know there's right and wrong, although we might differ what that looks like, how to apply it. We know there's justice. We know there's injustice. That's the point. And what follows, therefore, God exists. Therefore, God exists. The moral law is a powerful piece of evidence, that God is real. Two more signs, and we'll take questions. Sign, evidence 6, you might say, or the moral law points to a moral lawgiver. That's how I would frame it. The moral law points to a moral lawgiver. Evidence number 6 is modern day miracles. Modern day miracles. Now, one of the leading scholars in the world today on miracles you might recognize is Craig Keener, brilliant New Testament scholar. He comes out with a new commentary like every 6 months. I'm not exaggerating. I don't know how he does it. It's brilliant. He was writing a multi-volume commentary on Acts. And as he was going through it, he thought, you know what? There's a lot of miracles here in the book of Acts. Excuse me. I wonder if someone's done a deep dive academic look on the evidence for miracles today. So he paused, wrote a 2-volume academic study with Baker, 2010 and maybe 2011 might have been the second volume, doing a deep dive on miracles. About 2 or 3 years ago, he did a follow-up called Miracles Today, where he responded to objections and chronicled even further miracles, including what he says is some miracles captured on film. Now, don't YouTube miracles captured on film, probably generated by AI and cannot be trusted. But what he writes, he says this, the kinds of miracle claims frequently attested in the gospel and Acts are also attested by many eyewitnesses today. The blind receiving sight, the deaf hearing, people healed of certain sicknesses. Now, there's some miracles you don't see, like walking on water, which I think was a divine sign by Jesus, and there's a reason we don't see that today. Now, in a second, here's his recent book, Miracles Today, that if you want to research this down and study some of the sources, that is the one that I would recommend. But I'm going to ask you to participate here in a second with me. Not yet. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you believe you have seen or experienced a miracle. Now, not yet. Let me define what I don't mean by miracle. I don't mean 3 months ago during Christmas, you're like, oh man, I did not get my mom a gift. I need a parking spot to be available. I only have so much time before class, and you show up, bam, parking spot, there must be a God. Now, God might care about the small things in your life, but can we at least understand why an atheist would not find that very convincing? I'm talking about the kind of thing you've seen with your own eyes, or you've experienced, that can't be explained naturally and points towards the existence of the supernatural. If you have seen or experienced that personally, will you raise your hand for me? Raise your hand. Put it up high. Put up high if you have seen or experienced a miracle. Okay, look around. Maybe a quarter here. A quarter to a third. You can put your hands down. In audiences of which I do this, it's somewhere between a quarter and sometimes more than half. I've done this different denominations. I've done this dozens of times and consistently get the same response. Now, I wish we had a mic to go around and hear some of these stories, although that would make me nervous because there's always that guy, right? And if you think you're not that guy, that's because you are. In reality, if we had time, I think some of the stories would be moving and powerful and faith encouraging. According to Keener, there are hundreds of millions of Christians alive today who believe they have seen or experienced the miraculous. And they're getting documented in powerful ways. Modern day miracles point towards a miracle worker. And the last one, before we wrap up and take questions, is this: the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus. Gary Habermas is perhaps the world's leading expert on the resurrection. I would venture to say that he has probably studied the historical case for the resurrection as much or more than anybody who's ever lived. In 1976, he earned his PhD at Michigan State University, writing his thesis on the resurrection of Jesus, a rational inquiry. If you're going to defend the resurrection at Michigan State, obviously not a distinctly Christian school, you're going to have to make your case, especially if your doctoral advising team, not Christians, are going to sign off on it. We defended it, fell into a depression for about a decade. Less of a depression, more of like a doubt about this, and it affected him emotionally. He even considered becoming a Buddhist for a while. And I was interviewing him when what I showed you a minute ago, this is volume 1, by the way, of a 4-volume defense of the resurrection he is releasing right now. By the way, the first volume is 1,100 pages, and it actually weighs 5 pounds. So I bought 2 just to do flies with them. I was like, I'm going to work out with this thing, do some push-ups. Like, this is worth the price just in the weight of the book. He actually studied, I want to make sure I get this right, over 4,500 academic sources since 1975, and chronicled how scholars assess certain facts around the life of Jesus. And if you look in historical Jesus scholars, most are not evangelical scholars that teach at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary or Talbot School of Theology, where I teach. Most are more centrist or to the left by far. Well, what he concluded is there are certain basic facts that almost all scholars agree on. So there's near unanimous or high percentage of scholars that agree on them, and the evidence for these facts is significantly strong. So things like Jesus died by crucifixion. There is no good historical reason to doubt that Jesus died by crucifixion. It's multiply attested, it's early, there's medical evidence for it, no reason to doubt it. Second, the disciples report experiences with Jesus they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, this is worded very carefully. I mean, just let this sink in. The majority of scholars will concede or say that at least the disciples report experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus. So this isn't a story invented years later. Third, Saul became a follower of Jesus after having an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus. And fourth, slightly less, it's more like 80% than 90% plus of scholars believe the tomb of Jesus was found empty shortly after his death. Now, because these facts are so well substantiated, there's no naturalistic hypothesis, swoon theory, went to the wrong tomb, hallucinations that can account for all the facts. So if you say, well, the disciples hallucinated, that might get you number 2, but how do you get Saul in that group? He wasn't a member of the 12. And the body would still be in the tomb. Do you know what the big objection is today? The big objection is not on the facts, it's on the level of worldview. That when we look back in history, we know it's a broken chain of naturalistic events and miracles don't happen. That's a naturalistic assumption, friends, not something demonstrated by the facts. I had a chance to interview Gary. It was really interesting. And I said, Gary, you went through like 10 years of doubt that was painful. Would you have taken the time to write these 4 volumes and study this so intensely if you didn't go through this period of doubt? And I remember he kind of paused and looked at me and he's like, no, I don't think I would. That's God using our weaknesses for his good. Finally, I got an amen. I knew there were some Southern Baptists here. Thank you. The resurrection, I'd argue, confirms that Jesus as God's unique revelation in history. From the beginning and fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life and consciousness, to the existence of the moral law, from modern-day miracles to the historical evidence Jesus has risen, God is back in 2025. He is not dead. Claims that we could have this secular utopia if we got God out of the picture could not have been more mistaken. Now, does this mean people are rushing back to the church? No, I don't think it does. I think it means there's a secular void. I think there's a renewed openness. But people are turning to New Age, turning to psychedelics. Islam is growing worldwide. We have an opportunity, friends. The ball has been handed off to us. The question, are we going to run with it for the sake of the gospel and be faithful in this remarkable moment that God has given us?